I learned to be quiet before I learned to speak English. In our cramped apartment above Chen's Golden Palace, silence was survival, the space between my parents' exhausted whispers about unpaid suppliers and my mother's muffled sobs over letters from Taiwan that never brought good news. My parents had fled political persecution with nothing but medical degrees that meant nothing in America and a daughter they needed to protect from their own trauma. By age 7, I understood that emotional needs were luxuries we couldn't afford. My father worked 16-hour days managing the restaurant downstairs while my mother handled bookkeeping between her night shifts at the hospital cafeteria. Their love was expressed through sacrifice, not words, and my job was to be the perfect, undemanding daughter who never added to their already crushing weight. "Sophie, you understand?" "Yes," my mother would say in her careful English, counting cash receipts at our kitchen table while I did homework beside her. "We work hard so you have better life. You study hard, become doctor, lawyer. Something important. No time for feeling sorry for self." I internalized this lesson completely. Feelings were self-indulgent. Pain was weakness. The way to show love was through service, through making yourself useful, through absorbing other people's stress until they felt lighter and you felt nothing at all. I became an expert at reading my parents' moods, anticipating their needs, managing the household emotional temperature with the skill of someone twice my age. This training served me well academically. I was the student who never complained about overwhelming coursework, who helped struggling classmates while maintaining perfect grades, who absorbed group project stress until everyone else felt capable and confident. By the time I reached Northwestern as a psychology major, I'd perfected the art of being indispensable through invisible labor. I thought love meant collecting broken pieces and carefully arranging them until they looked whole. I never questioned why I was always the one bleeding from the sharp edges. David Castellano walked into my abnormal psychology lecture on a Tuesday in October, 20 minutes late and completely unbothered by the disruption he caused. Professor Williams paused mid-sentence as David scanned the auditorium for an empty seat, his sandy brown hair catching the fluorescent light like a spotlight. He was beautiful in that effortless way that some people are born with, the kind of symmetrical features that made you forget what you were thinking about. He slid into the seat beside me, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else. Alcohol, maybe, or the lingering sweetness of whatever he'd been drinking the night before. "Sorry," he whispered, not sounding sorry at all. Rough morning. I should have focused on Professor Williams' lecture about diagnostic criteria for personality disorders, but I found myself stealing glances at David as he took notes in handwriting that was surprisingly neat for someone who seemed so casually chaotic. There was something magnetic about his presence, a gravitational pull that made me want to orbit around him. After class, he lingered as other students filed out. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand with the confident smile of someone who'd never been rejected. "I don't think I've seen you around before." "Sophie Chen. I've been here since freshman year, actually." I shook his hand, noting how his grip lingered just long enough to suggest interest. "Sophie Chen," he repeated like he was testing how my name felt in his mouth. "You seem like you actually understand this psychology stuff. I'm drowning in abnormal psych, and my business advisor says I need to pass it to graduate on time. Think you could help me out sometime?" The request should have felt transactional, but David delivered it with such vulnerable charm that I felt chosen rather than used. This beautiful, confident senior needed my help. Me, the quiet girl who spent most college social events studying in her dorm room while her parents worked themselves into exhaustion downstairs at the restaurant. "Of course," I said, already mentally reorganizing my study schedule to accommodate his needs. "We could meet at the library tomorrow if you want." "Actually," David said, his expression shifting into something more intimate, "could we meet somewhere quieter? I have some personal stuff going on that makes it hard to concentrate in public spaces. Family drama, you know." I didn't know, but I nodded anyway, already invested in whatever story he was about to tell me. We exchanged numbers, and I felt a flutter of excitement that had nothing to do with academic tutoring. Our first study session took place in his off-campus apartment, a space that screamed inherited wealth. Hardwood floors, granite countertops, furniture that looked expensive and effortlessly coordinated. David made coffee in a machine that probably cost more than my monthly food budget, and I settled onto his leather couch with my psychology textbooks spread between us. "Before we start," David said, sitting closer to me than necessary, "I should probably explain why I'm struggling with this class. It's not that I'm not smart. I just have a hard time with the material because it hits too close to home." He paused, looking down at his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and I watched something vulnerable flicker across his features. "My father's an alcoholic. Violent when he drinks, which is most of the time. My mother copes with prescription pills. I spent my childhood mediating their fights, trying to keep the family from completely falling apart." The words hit me like physical blows. Here was this golden boy, this privileged senior with his expensive apartment and easy confidence, carrying trauma that made my parents' quiet struggles seem manageable by comparison. My heart opened. Immediately, instinctively, the way it had been trained to do whenever someone needed emotional support. "David, I'm so sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult." I reached across the space between us and touched his hand, feeling him relax under my fingers. "It makes perfect sense that abnormal psychology would be triggering for you. You're the first person who gets it," he said, looking up at me with those blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. "Most people hear alcoholic father and think they understand, but they don't know what it's like to be 7 years old and calling 911 because your dad passed out in his own vomit. They don't know what it's like to hide your mother's pill bottles and pretend everything's normal at school the next day." I felt tears prick my eyes, overwhelmed by the scope of his childhood trauma, and honored that he'd trusted me with something so personal. "You survived something most people couldn't handle. That takes incredible strength." "Sometimes I don't feel strong," David admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still that scared kid, just better at hiding it now." Without thinking, I moved closer and pulled him into a hug, feeling his body relax against mine as he buried his face in my shoulder. We stayed like that for several minutes, and I felt something shift between us, an intimacy that went far beyond academic tutoring or casual attraction. That night, we barely touched the psychology textbooks. Instead, David told me stories about his childhood that painted a picture of systematic trauma and emotional neglect. He described Christmas mornings spent cleaning up broken glass from his parents' fights, birthday parties that ended with police visits, family dinners that became battlegrounds over his father's drinking, and his mother's increasing detachment from reality. I listened with the focused attention I'd learned to give my parents when they occasionally shared pieces of their own trauma, absorbing every detail and offering validation and strategic advice. By the time I left his apartment at midnight, I felt like I understood David completely. And more importantly, I felt needed in a way that made my entire body hum with purpose. The pattern established itself within weeks. David would text me during my study sessions, needing to process some family crisis or workplace slight from his internship. I'd drop whatever I was doing and either go to his apartment or spend hours on the phone talking him through his emotional spirals, offering the kind of patient, professional-level support that his actual family had never provided. "Soph, you're so lucky your parents just want you to succeed," David said during one of our late-night calls, his voice thick with wine and self-pity. "You don't understand what it's like to have genuinely traumatic family dynamics. Your stress about grades and money is just normal college stuff compared to real psychological damage." I internalized this hierarchy of suffering immediately, convinced that my own struggles were somehow less valid than his dramatic dysfunction. My parents' quiet sacrifices and 16-hour workdays seemed mundane compared to David's explosive family stories. My academic anxiety and financial pressure felt trivial next to his identity crises and abandonment trauma. Within a month, my GPA had dropped from a 3.8 to a 3.4 as I prioritized David's emotional needs over my own coursework. But I told myself this was love. This willingness to sacrifice my own success to help someone else heal from trauma that made my own childhood look privileged by comparison. I became an expert in David's psychology while remaining a stranger to my own, studying his triggers and trauma responses with more dedication than I applied to my actual psychology courses. Every crisis I helped him navigate felt like proof of my value. Every emotional breakthrough we achieved together felt like evidence of our deep connection. I thought love meant collecting broken pieces and carefully arranging them until they looked whole. What I didn't realize was that I was always the one bleeding from the sharp edges, slowly cutting myself to pieces in service of someone else's healing. By our 6-month anniversary, I had memorized the warning signs of David's anxiety attacks with the precision of a medical professional. The slight tremor in his hands when he was overwhelmed, the way his breathing became shallow when discussing his father, the particular glassy look in his eyes that meant he was dissociating from whatever trigger had sent him spiraling. I kept a mental catalog of therapeutic techniques I'd researched specifically for his symptoms: grounding exercises for panic attacks, breathing patterns for anxiety spirals, cognitive behavioral strategies for catastrophic thinking. My browser history looked like a graduate student's research project, filled with articles about trauma responses, attachment disorders, and coping mechanisms for adult children of alcoholics. "Sophie, I need you." David's voice through my phone was ragged with panic, cutting through my concentration on a research paper that was due the next morning. It was 2:17 a.m., and I'd been working on the assignment for 6 hours, finally finding my rhythm with the complex theoretical framework I was analyzing. "What's wrong?" I was already closing my laptop, abandoning my work with the automatic response I'd developed over months of crisis management. "I can't breathe. My chest feels like it's caving in. I think I'm having a heart attack." His words came out in gasps, and I could hear him pacing in the background, probably wearing a path in his expensive hardwood floors. "David, you're having a panic attack, not a heart attack. Remember what we practiced?" I pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, already grabbing my keys. "I need you to focus on my voice and count your breaths with me. In for 4 counts. Hold 4. 4? Out for 6. I drove to his apartment while talking him through the breathing exercise, my own heart racing with adrenaline and the familiar rush of being needed in a crisis. By the time I arrived, David had calmed enough to unlock his door, but his face was still pale and his hands were shaking. "Thank God you're here," he said, pulling me into a desperate hug. I don't know what triggered it. I was just lying in bed thinking about my internship evaluation next week, and suddenly I couldn't get enough air. I guided him to his couch and spent the next 3 hours talking him through progressive muscle relaxation, helping him identify the thought patterns that had triggered the attack, and researching breathing techniques that might prevent future episodes. By the time I got back to my dorm, it was 6 a.m. and my research paper deadline had passed. "You could have just asked for an extension," my roommate Jessica pointed out as I explained why I looked like I'd been hit by a truck. "Professors are usually understanding about emergencies." But how could I explain that my boyfriend's panic attack felt more urgent than my own academic success? How could I articulate that David's healing had become more important to me than my own education? I took the failing grade on the paper and told myself it was the price of love. The crisis calls became more frequent as David's stress levels increased with his senior year responsibilities. Job interviews sent him into spirals of inadequacy that required hours of validation and strategic advice. Workplace conflicts with his internship supervisor needed detailed analysis and coached responses. Every family phone call from his alcoholic father triggered days of emotional processing that I managed with the dedication of a full-time therapist. But my emotional labor extended far beyond the crisis calls. David's coping mechanisms were consistently destructive, and I became expert at damage control. When he drank too much at parties and became verbally aggressive with other students, I apologized for his behavior and created elaborate explanations about his trauma responses. When he disappeared for days without explanation during stressful periods, I covered for him with friends and professors, claiming he had family emergencies or medical issues. "Sophie, where's David?" my friend Melissa asked during a study group session. "He was supposed to bring research for our group project, and he's been completely MIA for 3 days. "Family crisis," I lied smoothly, already texting David to check if he was ready to emerge from whatever emotional hiding place he'd retreated to. His father relapsed, and he had to deal with some urgent family stuff. I'll get his research from him and send it to everyone tonight." I spent that evening researching and writing David's portion of the group project while he lay on his couch in a depressive episode, staring at the ceiling and occasionally offering suggestions about what I should include. My own coursework suffered while I managed his academic responsibilities, but I told myself this was temporary, just until he developed better coping mechanisms. The pattern consumed my social life gradually, then completely. Friends stopped inviting me to events because I was always unavailable, either managing David's latest crisis or too exhausted from emotional labor to engage with normal college activities. My world narrowed to my classes, my part-time job at the campus bookstore, and David's emotional needs. "I'm worried about you," Jessica said one evening, watching me cancel another dinner plan to talk David through his anxiety about a job interview. "You've become completely absorbed in his problems. When's the last time you did something just for yourself?" I couldn't remember. Every decision I made was filtered through the question of how it would affect David's emotional stability. I chose classes based on schedules that would leave me available for his crisis calls. I worked extra shifts at the bookstore to help with his expenses when his trust fund payments were late. I researched internship opportunities for him while neglecting my own career development. But the most insidious part of the dynamic was how David had trained me to dismiss my own struggles as insignificant compared to his trauma. When I mentioned the stress of balancing work and school while managing his emotional needs, he'd respond with stories about his childhood that made my exhaustion seem selfish by comparison. "At least your parents support your education," he'd say when I complained about being overwhelmed. "You don't know what it's like to have a father who spent your college fund on alcohol and a mother who's too medicated to remember your name. Your problems are just normal college stress." I internalized this hierarchy completely, convincing myself that my emotional needs were somehow less valid than his dramatic family dysfunction. When my parents called to express concern about my falling grades, I brushed off their worries and focused on David's more urgent psychological crises. When I developed chronic insomnia from the stress of managing both our lives, I researched sleep techniques for David's anxiety-induced sleeplessness instead of addressing my own symptoms. The breaking point should have come earlier, but I was too invested in the narrative that love meant sacrifice, that empathy required self-erasure, that healing someone else was more important than maintaining my own psychological well-being. I'd become fluent in David's pain while forgetting the language of my own needs, expert in his triggers while remaining oblivious to my own trauma responses. Every crisis I solved for David was another piece of myself I lost, another boundary I dissolved in service of his healing. I was disappearing into his trauma, becoming a support system rather than a person, a resource rather than a partner. But I couldn't see the pattern because I was repeating the dynamic I'd learned in childhood, absorbing other people's stress until they felt lighter and I felt nothing at all. The worst part wasn't that David was using me. The worst part was that I was using his trauma to avoid facing my own unexamined wounds, his dramatic crises to distract myself from the quiet desperation of my own unmet needs. I'd become addicted to being needed, to feeling valuable through service, to avoiding my own emotional landscape by expertly navigating his. I had become fluent in his pain while forgetting the language of my own needs. Every crisis I solved for him was another piece of myself I lost, and I was losing myself so gradually, so completely, that I didn't even realize I was disappearing until there was almost nothing left to save. The call from my mother came at 7:23 a.m. on a Thursday in March, interrupting my morning routine of checking David's mood via text before starting my own day. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, fractured with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. "Sophie, your grandmother is very sick. The doctors in Taipei say—" Her English faltered, reverting to Mandarin for the words she couldn't bear to say in her second language. "Cancer, stage 4, maybe 3 months." I sat on my dorm room floor in my pajamas, holding the phone with trembling hands as my mother explained the impossible mathematics of caring for someone dying 8,000 miles away. The plane tickets, the extended stays, the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. My parents' restaurant was already struggling, and now they needed to find money they didn't have for a crisis they couldn't avoid. We take out second mortgage, my mother said, trying to sound strong. Your father, he wants to go next week, stay with Nai for maybe 1 month. But restaurant, ... Mom, I can help, I said immediately, already calculating how many extra shifts I could pick up at the bookstore, how I could liquidate my small savings account, how I could make this crisis manageable for everyone else. I can work more hours, send you money every week. No, Sophie, you focus on school. Graduate with good grades, get into good program. That's how you help family, by becoming successful, not by sacrificing your education for old woman's problems. But I was already mentally reorganizing my life around this emergency, the same way I'd reorganized it around David's emotional needs. I hung up and immediately started researching work-study opportunities, loan options, anything that could generate the money my family needed while I maintained my academic performance and continued managing David's psychological crises. For 2 weeks, I existed in a state of barely controlled panic. I picked up extra shifts at the bookstore, worked late into the night on grad school applications, and maintained my usual availability for David's emotional support needs. I was sleeping 3 hours a night and surviving on coffee and adrenaline, but I told myself this was temporary, just until my family situation stabilized. The breaking point came in the library on a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting in my usual spot on the 3rd floor, surrounded by grad school application materials and research for a paper on attachment theory, when my chest suddenly felt like it was caving in. The words on the page blurred together, my hands started shaking uncontrollably, and I couldn't catch my breath no matter how hard I tried. Panic attack. I recognized the symptoms from all my research on David's anxiety disorders, but experiencing it myself was completely different. Like drowning in air, like my body was betraying me in the most fundamental way possible. I grabbed my phone with fumbling fingers and called the one person who'd taught me everything I knew about managing psychological crises. David, I need help, I whispered into the phone, trying not to hyperventilate in the middle of the quiet study space. I think I'm having a panic attack. Sophie, I can't handle heavy emotional stuff right now. David's voice was impatient, distracted. My dad called drunk last night and I'm barely keeping it together. Can we talk about this later when I'm in a better headspace? The line went dead and I stared at my phone in complete disbelief. For 2.5 years, I had dropped everything, assignments, sleep, social plans, my own psychological well-being, to be available for David's emotional crises. I had researched therapeutic techniques, memorized his triggers, and sacrificed my academic performance to provide him with professional-level emotional support. And the first time I needed the same support, he couldn't spare 5 minutes because my breakdown was inconvenient for his emotional schedule. I managed to get through the panic attack alone, using the same breathing techniques I'd taught David hundreds of times. But something fundamental had shifted in that library cubicle. Something that couldn't be undone by apologies or explanations. For the first time in our relationship, I saw our dynamic with perfect clarity. I was his unpaid therapist, available 24/7 for his healing, but he was not my partner in any meaningful sense of the word. The next 2 weeks confirmed everything I'd realized in that moment of crisis. David remained mysteriously unavailable for emotional support while I juggled my family emergency, work obligations, and academic deadlines. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed, he responded with his usual dismissive hierarchy of trauma. At least your family problems are just money issues, he said during one of our brief phone calls, clearly distracted by something else. Financial stress is normal compared to real psychological trauma. Your grandmother being sick isn't the same as having an alcoholic father who calls you drunk at 3 a.m. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest as he spoke. David had spent years training me to minimize my own struggles, to accept that his dramatic family dysfunction was somehow more valid than my quiet, persistent stress. But in that moment, I finally understood that emotional pain doesn't have a hierarchy, it just has different expressions. The revelation came through absence rather than confrontation. David announced casually, almost as an afterthought, that he was going to Cabo for spring break with his business school friends. A trip he'd apparently been planning for months, but had somehow forgotten to mention until 3 days before departure. "It's been such a stressful semester," he said, packing expensive vacation clothes while I sat on his bed, exhausted from another double shift at the bookstore. "I really need this time to decompress and reset my mental health." For 7 days, I experienced life without managing David's emotional needs, and the relief was overwhelming. I read entire chapters without interruption from crisis calls. I had conversations with friends that weren't dominated by David's latest trauma. I worked on grad school applications without constantly monitoring my phone for his anxiety attacks. I rediscovered parts of myself that had been suffocated by constant caretaking. Most importantly, I had space to process my own emotions for the first time in years. I called my parents every day, offering genuine support for their impossible situation. I researched grief counseling resources for my grandmother's decline. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my family's crisis without minimizing it to make room for someone else's more dramatic suffering. When David returned from Cabo, tanned and relaxed and full of stories about his amazing breakthrough week, he expected to resume our usual dynamic immediately. He launched into detailed accounts of his vacation insights about personal growth and emotional healing, apparently unaware that I'd spent the week discovering what my life felt like without his constant emotional demands. "Soph, you seem different," he said, settling onto my dorm room bed with the casual assumption that I'd be available to process his vacation revelations. "You're being kind of distant. Is everything okay?" I looked at him. This beautiful, privileged man who'd never questioned his right to my emotional labor, and realized I couldn't pretend anymore. The woman who'd answered his 2 a.m. crisis calls while neglecting her own panic attacks, who'd researched therapeutic techniques for his healing while ignoring her own trauma responses, who'd made his psychological well-being more important than her own education. That woman was gone. "Everything's fine," I said, but we both knew it was a lie. Something fundamental had changed during his absence, and neither of us could pretend that our relationship would survive my awakening. The moment I stopped managing his emotions, I remembered what mine felt like. The silence of his absence was louder than years of his trauma dumping, and I finally understood that loving someone shouldn't require disappearing into their pain. The breakup was messier than I'd anticipated, primarily because David couldn't comprehend why I was suddenly unavailable for emotional labor. What I'd planned as a calm, mature conversation about needing space became a 3-hour confrontation in his apartment, with David cycling through every manipulation technique I'd unknowingly taught him to use. "Sophie, you're abandoning me during the most difficult time of my life," he said, pacing his living room like a caged animal. "My father's drinking is getting worse. My job interviews aren't going well, and now you're adding to my stress by creating relationship drama. This isn't like you." "You're right," I said, sitting on his couch and watching him perform his familiar anxiety spiral. "The Sophie you knew would have dropped everything to manage your emotional crisis. But I'm not that person anymore." "What's that supposed to mean?" David stopped pacing and stared at me with genuine confusion. "You're the most empathetic person I know. You've always been there for me when I needed support. Why are you being so cold?" "I'm not being cold, David. I'm being unavailable for unpaid emotional labor." The clinical language felt strange in my mouth, but I'd been reading about codependency and emotional exploitation, trying to understand what had happened to me over the past 3 years. David's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "Unpaid emotional labor? Jesus, Sophie, you sound like you've been reading too many feminist blogs. I never asked you to be my therapist. You chose to help because you cared about me. Now you're acting like I somehow victimized you." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. I had chosen to provide therapeutic support, had volunteered for crisis management duty, had prioritized his healing over my own well-being. But understanding my complicity didn't erase the fundamental imbalance of our relationship or the way he'd learned to weaponize his vulnerability. "You're right that I chose to help," I said carefully. "But you also learned to expect that help as your right rather than my gift. You learned to demand emotional support while being unavailable to provide it. You learned to make your trauma more important than my stress. Your healing more urgent than my education. That's not fair, Sophie. You know my childhood was genuinely traumatic. I'm dealing with real psychological damage, not just normal college stress. David's voice carried that familiar tone of wounded innocence, the implication that my struggles were somehow less valid than his dramatic dysfunction. But I'd spent the past month researching trauma responses and attachment disorders, and I finally understood that pain doesn't have a hierarchy. It just has different expressions. David, everyone's trauma is real to them. The fact that yours was more dramatic doesn't make it more deserving of support. The conversation continued for hours, with David alternating between accusations of manipulation, promises to change, and detailed recitations of his childhood trauma designed to pull me back into caretaking mode. But something fundamental had shifted during his spring break absence, and I couldn't unsee what I'd learned about our dynamic. I ended the relationship that night, walking away from 3 years of emotional investment with the strange relief of someone finally putting down a weight they didn't realize they'd been carrying. David's final words followed me out of his apartment. "You'll regret this, Sophie. No one will ever need you the way I do." He was right, and that was exactly the point. Graduate school in clinical psychology became my salvation and my education simultaneously. I chose Northwestern's counseling program specifically because I wanted to understand the dynamics I'd lived through with David, to develop professional frameworks for experiences that had nearly destroyed me personally. The coursework was brutal in the way that all worthwhile transformations are. I studied attachment theory and codependency, trauma bonding and emotional manipulation, the psychology of caretaking and the dynamics of exploitative relationships. Every case study reminded me of my own experience. Every theoretical framework helped me understand another piece of what had happened to me. Sophie, you have an intuitive understanding of attachment trauma that's unusual for someone early in their training, Professor Martinez told me during my second year. Your insights about emotional labor dynamics are particularly sophisticated. Have you considered specializing in relationship therapy? I had, actually. My thesis focused on emotional labor patterns in college relationships, using anonymous survey data to explore how young women often became unpaid therapists for male partners who weaponized vulnerability to avoid reciprocal emotional support. The research validated everything I'd experienced with David while providing me with clinical language to describe dynamics I'd previously accepted as normal. The program took 6 years total, 2 years of intensive coursework, 1 year of practicum at the University Counseling Center, 2 years of supervised clinical hours at a community mental health clinic, and another year building my private practice while completing licensing requirements. During my training, I earned $45,000 annually while accumulating the 4,000 clinical hours required for licensure, working primarily with clients who struggled with codependency and boundary issues. Opening my private practice was a calculated risk. I started part-time while maintaining my clinic position, charging $120 per session, the standard rate for newly licensed therapists in Chicago. My specialty in relationship dynamics and emotional boundary work gradually built a steady client base, mostly women dealing with codependency issues and men learning to manage their emotions without relying on partners as unpaid support systems. "Dr. Chen, you saved my life," one client told me during our final session. I was completely lost in my boyfriend's trauma, convinced that my job was to heal him while ignoring my own needs. You taught me that love doesn't require self-erasure. Every technique I learned to help others set boundaries was a step toward honoring the boundaries I'd never been taught I deserved to have. Every client I helped recognize emotional manipulation was validation for my own experience with David. Every successful therapeutic relationship I facilitated proved that healthy emotional support was reciprocal, boundaried, and sustainable. 5 years after finishing my program, I was earning $85,000 annually with a waiting list for new clients. I'd raised my rate to $140 per session and was considering another increase, having developed a reputation as the therapist who specialized in helping people recover from emotionally exploitative relationships. My practice became a sanctuary for people who'd learned to confuse love with servitude, empathy with self-erasure, support with sacrifice. I helped women recognize when their emotional labor was being exploited, taught men how to develop emotional intelligence without relying on partners as surrogate therapists, and facilitated healing for people who'd been taught that their worth came from how much they could endure rather than how much they could contribute. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal, cellular, fundamental. The girl who'd absorbed everyone else's trauma without question became the woman who taught people that emotional support was a professional skill worthy of compensation and respect. I'd turned my deepest wound into my greatest strength, my most painful experience into meaningful work that helped others avoid similar exploitation. Every client who paid my fee was validating what David had spent years dismissing, that emotional labor had measurable worth, that psychological insight deserved compensation, that helping people heal was professional work worthy of professional respect. I'd learned to value my emotional expertise enough to charge for it, and the world had responded by proving that expertise was worth exactly what I said it was. The woman who'd once provided therapeutic support for free to someone who refused to reciprocate had become a professional who charged market rate for her emotional intelligence, and business was excellent. David's email arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, 8 years after our breakup, sliding into my professional inbox like a ghost from a life I'd methodically reconstructed. I was reviewing session notes for my 10 a.m. client, a woman learning to recognize emotional manipulation after years of providing unpaid therapy to her narcissistic husband, when his name appeared in my notifications. Dr. Sophia Chen in the subject line, formal and calculated as if we were strangers conducting business rather than former intimate partners with a history of emotional exploitation. I stared at the sender name for a full minute, feeling something cold and clinical settle in my chest. Not the panic I might have experienced years earlier, but the analytical detachment I'd developed through thousands of hours of professional training. "Hi, Sophia," the email began, and I immediately noted his strategic use of my full name, designed to establish professional distance while acknowledging my credentials. "I came across your website while researching therapists in Chicago and was surprised to see your name. Congratulations on building such a successful practice. I've been going through a difficult time lately and wondered if you might have space for a new client, or could recommend someone who specializes in relationship issues." I recognized every manipulation technique he'd employed, the casual tone designed to minimize our history, the immediate pivot to his emotional needs, the assumption that I'd prioritize his request over professional boundaries. But what struck me most was his fundamental misunderstanding of who I'd become. The Sophie he remembered would have dropped everything to help, would have felt guilty for even considering boundaries, would have made his crisis her priority regardless of professional ethics. But I wasn't Sophie anymore. I was Dr. Sophia Chen, licensed professional counselor, with a thriving practice built on helping people recover from exactly the kind of dynamic David and I had shared. I'd spent 8 years transforming my deepest trauma into my most valuable expertise, and his email read like a case study in the behavioral patterns I helped clients recognize and heal from. My response was professionally appropriate and strategically devastating. "Hi, David. Thank you for your inquiry. I don't provide services to former personal acquaintances due to ethical boundaries, but I can recommend several excellent therapists who specialize in relationship dynamics. Dr. Jennifer Walsh at North Shore Counseling has extensive experience in this area and charges $150 per session. I hope you find the support you're looking for." His reply came within 3 hours, fast enough to suggest he'd been monitoring his email, waiting for my response like the old days when he'd expected immediate availability for his emotional crises. "Sophia, I wasn't necessarily asking you to be my therapist. I thought maybe we could catch up first, see how we're both doing. It seems weird to be so formal when we used to be close." The audacity was breathtaking. After 8 years of no contact, he expected me to provide emotional support under the guise of friendship, without acknowledging that our entire relationship had been built on exactly that exploitative dynamic. He was attempting to bypass professional boundaries by appealing to personal history, as if our past intimacy entitled him to my current expertise. I drafted my response with the precision I used for treatment plans, each word chosen to maintain boundaries while offering appropriate resources. David, I understand you're looking for support, and I genuinely hope you find it. However, given our history, I don't feel comfortable mixing personal and professional relationships. Dr. Walsh really is excellent. I'd encourage you to schedule a consultation with her. His final email revealed his true expectations and confirmed everything I'd learned about his character through professional training. I can't believe how cold you've become. The Sophie I knew would never have turned away someone who needed help. I guess success really changes people. I read his words with the clinical detachment I'd developed through years of analyzing manipulative communication patterns. He was attempting to shame me back into free emotional labor by appealing to a past version of myself who didn't understand her worth, trying to reframe my professional boundaries as personal cruelty. It was textbook manipulation, the kind of behavior I helped clients recognize and resist every day. The real revelation wasn't David's predictable response. It was my complete absence of emotional reactivity to his manipulation attempts. The woman who'd once absorbed his every crisis, who'd prioritized his healing over her own education, who'd made herself available for unpaid therapeutic support at all hours, felt nothing but professional curiosity about his continued patterns of emotional exploitation. I didn't respond to his final email. Professional boundaries meant not engaging with manipulative communication, regardless of personal history or emotional triggers. Instead, I filed the entire exchange in my practice management system as documentation of appropriate boundary maintenance, then moved on to preparing for my next client session. 6 months later, Dr. Jennifer Walsh mentioned during a professional consultation that she'd been working with a particularly challenging client who struggled with emotional boundaries in relationships. We met monthly to discuss difficult cases, maintaining appropriate confidentiality while sharing therapeutic strategies. He keeps referencing an ex-girlfriend who used to understand him but became cold and professional, Jennifer said, reviewing her session notes. It's fascinating how some people interpret healthy boundaries as personal rejection. He seems genuinely confused that she won't provide free emotional support disguised as friendship. I nodded with professional sympathy, understanding exactly what her client was experiencing. For the first time in his adult life, David was paying market rate for the emotional support he'd always expected to receive for free. He was learning that professional therapeutic relationships came with boundaries, time limits, and financial investment, all the elements that made emotional labor sustainable rather than exploitative. "How's his progress?" I asked, genuinely curious about whether David was capable of developing healthier relationship patterns. "Slow," Jennifer admitted. "He's very invested in the narrative that he's been victimized by people who changed rather than examining his own patterns of emotional dependence. But he keeps showing up and paying the fee, which suggests some level of commitment to the process." The image of David writing a check for therapeutic services he'd once expected to receive for free felt like poetic justice. The man who'd dismissed my expertise while benefiting from my emotional labor was finally learning what that expertise was worth in professional terms. He was paying $150 per session for the same quality of emotional support I'd provided him for 3 years without compensation or recognition. But the real victory wasn't David's forced acknowledgement of therapeutic value. It was my complete transformation from victim to professional, from someone who absorbed others' trauma to someone who helped people process their own pain with dignity and appropriate support. Every client who paid my fee validated what David had spent years dismissing, that emotional labor had measurable worth, that psychological insight deserved compensation, that helping people heal was professional work worthy of respect. My practice had become a sanctuary for people recovering from emotionally exploitative relationships, a place where they learned to recognize manipulation, establish boundaries, and value their own emotional expertise. I helped women understand that love didn't require self-erasure, taught men to develop emotional intelligence without relying on partners as surrogate therapists, and facilitated healing for people who'd confused empathy with enabling. Standing in my office that evening, looking out at the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows I'd paid for with fees from professional emotional labor, I reflected on the journey from David's unpaid therapist to my own successful practice. The girl who'd answered every 2 a.m. crisis call had become the woman who charged $150 per session and maintained a waiting list of clients eager to pay for her expertise. I used to think empathy was my superpower, but I learned that boundaries were my real strength. The girl who'd absorbed everyone else's trauma while ignoring her own needs had become the woman who taught people that their pain was worth professional respect and appropriate compensation. David was finally paying market rate for emotional support, learning that healing required investment rather than exploitation, and I was thriving as the professional I'd always been, just now with appropriate compensation, clear boundaries, and the deep satisfaction that comes from transforming trauma into expertise. The trauma he'd dumped on me like I was his free therapist had taught me exactly how much my emotional intelligence was worth. Now I charged accordingly, and my practice was booked solid with people grateful to pay for what I'd once given away for free. Business had never been better. If Sophie's transformation from free therapist to paid professional hit different, smash that subscribe button because your emotional labor has value and deserves compensation. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been someone's unpaid therapist while your own needs got dismissed as overthinking? Your healing journey matters, and this community is here to remind you that boundaries aren't selfish, they're survival. Strong sparkles.